Mr. Toye, the chairman of the board of the Toronto Blizzard, and all these many years in the North American Soccer League. This is the gentleman that brought Pelé to the United States, that brought Franz Beckenbauer to the United States. This is the fellow who really put soccer on its feet here in this country. Clive, congratulations on assuming the duties of chairman of the board of the Toronto Blizzard, and congratulations on the position Toronto now has going once again for the bowl.
Yeah, it's kind of you, Howard. We're obviously delighted for the second time in a row we're in the Soccer Bowl series. Trying to win it this time instead of losing as we did last year to Tulsa in Vancouver. Disappointed, even though I'm talking in Comiskey Park, Chicago, disappointed that we're not playing Vancouver in Soccer Bowl because they're our natural rivals. We've had some pretty hot games with Vancouver. They don't like us in BC, and we don't like the Whitecaps too much in Ontario. So we had been looking forward to having the home game advantage with the Whitecaps. As it is, you and the people of the Sting messed that idea up by a tremendous victory in the semifinals. But it is good for us. We think we've built the core of a team which is going to stay together for a long, long time. We haven't made many changes over the past year or two. A lot of young players who obviously can only get better under good coaching. So we're looking forward to this as not only the second Soccer Bowl the Blizzard's in, but the second of many more to come.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey there, everybody. What's new? How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is, of course, Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate tremendously your finding us here in the wild and woolly world of podcast land. We know how hard it is to find quality stuff out there, and we appreciate you finding us, downloading us, and of course, rating and reviewing us and subscribing to us, doing whatever you can to listen to and, of course, share and recommend this little show. We appreciate it very much, and we also appreciate you staying tuned for a tremendous and wonderful conversation with the legendary Soccer Hall of Famer Clive Toye, who you heard there in the intro being introduced in the courtesy of the Wayback Machine. Back in 1984, that was a clip from, I think it was halftime of the first game number 1 of the 1984 NASL Soccer Bowl. That year, I think, was the first year that they decided to make the Soccer Bowl a 3-game best of series versus a 1-game winner-take-all game. And that, again, was 1984. And when Clive, as we'll get to in our conversation, was the president, chairman, general manager, chief cook, and bottle washer for the Toronto Blizzard of the NASL in its last year. As a matter of fact, the entire league was in its last year. As a matter of fact, that clip wound up being the second to last game ever played in the North American Soccer League. And there's a lot of sort of consternation and question marks circling the North American Soccer League at that time in 1984. You could probably hear a little bit of it behind the scenes in between in the words there in that little interview clip. But we're going to get into all of that, of course, and prior to all of that, just the actual rise of the league, of the North American Soccer League, which Clive was instrumental in, frankly. Besides, say, somebody like Phil Woosnam, the longtime and former and now deceased commissioner of the North American Soccer League, there's probably nobody more quintessentially relevant and important in the history of that league, the North American Soccer League, than that of Clive Toye. We're going to get into his entire very impressive and story-filled career through the primordial ooze of the NASL, that being the International Soccer League, with a guy named Bill Cox, who we've talked about in a previous episode or two, who ran something called the International Soccer League, which was sort of this international round-robin tournament in the United States. Of course, the 1966 World Cup in England fueled even more interest in the sport here in terms of getting some professional leagues going, plural. There were no fewer than 3 entities that wanted to get leagues running, and 2 of them wound up doing so in 1967. You're going to hear from Clive and his work with Bill Cox, as well as Mr. Cox's involvement in one of those two leagues, the NPSL, National Professional Soccer League. We've talked about that in a few episodes as well, and how that led to the NASL, which was sort of the repository of the two leagues that came together after a somewhat disastrous 1967, competing against each other to create at least one standalone league in 1968. And you're going to hear an amazing set of stories from Clive in our chat in a few minutes about sort of what sort of transpired there. As a matter of fact, it was basically the league on life support for a few years, and then slowly but surely through the efforts of Clive Toye, Phil Woosnam, and a handful of other long-term believers, Lamar Hunt, of course, and a few others, got the league back on its feet and then some into just an absolute crazy time in the latter part of the decade in the early 1980s. We get into all of that, not only the league, but the teams like the Baltimore Bays of the NPSL and then NASL, the New York Cosmos, which Clive Toye was essentially the architect of, at least until 1977 or so, when the team really was rocketing to the super stratosphere. The Chicago Sting makes an appearance for a couple of years, as well as the Toronto Blizzard, as we've mentioned before. A lot more to come in our conversation with the American Soccer Hall of Famer Clive Toye in just a couple of seconds. Please stay tuned for that. You're going to love it, I assure you. A couple of promotional friends and notes we want to share with you. We want to say hello again to our relatively new sponsors, oldschoolshirts.com. Our friends out of Cincinnati that have just an amazing array, and you're going to find a lot of North American Soccer League stuff in there. Maybe some NPSL jerseys and shirts and T-shirts, etc. as well. I don't know about jerseys, but shirts for sure. And it is the place to find just an amazing trove of shirts with all kinds of great logos and teams no longer with us, leagues, as well as just cool cultural stuff from decades past as well. You're just going to get lost in oldschoolshirts.com. And of course, when you find something you like, and you're going to find something, I'm pretty sure of that, use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout and get 10% off of all of your purchases. Oldschoolshirts.com. Give it a try. Take a look. I guarantee you're going to find it really cool. And make sure you use that promo code GOODSEATS to get your 10% off all of your purchases. And once you're done there, I want you to point your browser, why don't you, to our friends also at sportshistorycollectibles.com. No relation, despite the similar sounding site. Sportshistorycollectibles.com, run by our friend Dean Mitchell out in San Diego, has just an amazing array of memorabilia. So from teams and leagues and nearly departed or dearly departed franchises no longer with us. So once you find that shirt or two to reminisce about the team or the league that you're missing desperately, why not go over to sportshistorycollectibles.com and find a few actual artifacts from said team? That could be press guides or bumper stickers or media guides. Occasionally there's some outerwear or shirts, but programs and yearbooks and you name it, pennants, all kinds of stuff. And there's new inventory almost every week, and it's beautifully photographed. Again, you will get lost there as well. sportshistorycollectibles.com. And of course, we got a promo code for you there too. And that is, can you believe it? Good Seats. Good Seats is the promo code for sportshistorycollectibles.com. Get 15% off all of your purchases, he says, there. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we thank them for their sponsorship of our little show here as well. All right, let's segue right into our great conversation. This is one I've been anticipating for quite some time, and I was privileged to have some time to chat with the great, the legendary, and the very instrumental builder of much of the North American Soccer League through much of its history. Just about, he was pretty much there from the beginning to the end. His name is Clive Toye, and here's our conversation coming up. Maybe it would help the audience a bit to sort of give a little bit of background of Clive Toye before and then how he became ensnared in this American soccer thing.
You mean with stupidity or ambition? I mean, which of those two would you prefer?
Well, I sense it's a melange of the two.
I was a journalist
I started as a journalist when I was 17. In those days, once you'd had a decent education, you didn't waste your time going to college for 4 years. So I started as a journalist at the age of 17, became the chief sports writer of that newspaper, moved to a bigger one, became the chief football writer for the Daily Express, which at that time was the largest circulation newspaper in the English-speaking world, 4.5 million a day, syndicated from all over the world, from Vancouver to the South China Morning Post, and in the process was sent to all over the world to cover soccer, which included once in 61 being sent to North America. First time I'd been here, I'd been to Asia before. I was in the army in the Korean War, and I'd been all over Europe covering soccer. But this was my first trip to North America, and all kinds of stuff to cover. World Cup golf in Dorado Beach, Puerto Rico. 4 4-minute milers up at Harvard Stadium, world title fight, and a rather unimportant thing called the International Soccer League, which was put together by a fellow called Bill Cox, who during the war, I gather, had owned the Philadelphia baseball team and got chucked out of baseball for some misdemeanor. And Bill would invite teams from overseas into New York once a year to play this International Soccer League. He had a local team, the New York Americans, and on this occasion had two clubs from Britain, Kilmarnock from Scotland, Everton from England, and so I covered all of that. In the course of that, met Bill Cox, who said, one day we're going to have a professional league in America, build the game. Wonderful, I said. That's interesting. So I wrote 8 paragraphs about that on a quiet day when there was nothing else to write about. It was hardly, it seemed, the most important story of the year. And as the years passed by, Bill, very nice fellow, I got on with him very well. He used to come and see me in New York to ask me phone numbers for this team or that team that he was bringing over. And on one occasion, he turned up with another bunch of American guys who talked about, oh, yes, we want to start a professional league, etc. But with the World Cup coming up in England, 66, I wasn't too interested, although I did write some stories. And I wrote one story about the fact that Phil Woosnam, who was then a player with Aston Villa, Phil Woosnam had shown interest in going to America, and so there was a story in the paper. Woosnam was interested. Strange that Phil and I ended up running the league, but who would have known that at the time? So eventually, after the World Cup was over, everyone came back again, talking seriously about starting the league. And as I'd covered everything in soccer by then, it seemed a bit interesting. My wife and I said, well, why don't we go to America and introduce soccer and have some fun and learn some things and see a different place and come back again to England in 2 years' time. So I said, I want a job. And I got offered 5 or 6 jobs, took one of them as general manager of the Baltimore Bays. And that was 51 years ago, and the 2 years that we intended to stay here have somewhat lengthened.
Well, so let's back up for a second. So did you, the ISL, right? So an interesting story. We've delved a little bit into it as sort of the primordial ooze, if you will, of what became the 3, I guess then became 2 professional leagues that kind of get going in 67. But what was your impression of the ISL? Because obviously, how can I best put this? That notion of bringing, quote unquote, the best international talent to these shores has seemingly been and still is, right, with the International Champions Cup and Charlie Stilitano and those folks, still sort of that, I don't know, that aura, right, that the American populace will only enjoy the best that there is on the planet. And the only way that they're going to really get to soccer is to see the best of soccer here on the shores versus starting something new.
No, I mean, Bill Cox was doing it because no one was going to turn up and pay 50 cents to watch any local players play. I mean, there were various ethnic groups where pretty decent players emerged, but they were confined to Little Italy in New York, or the Colombians down in Kendall in Florida. As a whole, that was never going to get in the papers. So by doing what Bill Cox was doing, he was doing that to introduce the game more and more to people in the hope that they would then one day be interested in the league that he wanted to start. What Charlie Stilitano and his mob are doing now has got nothing to do with growing soccer. It's to do with making money, because soccer's already grown. You still get looking at the attendances this weekend in MLS. 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. Hey, that'll do. So it is a different thing. The international games then were meant to promote the game. The international games now are to make money for those who are promoting the international games, and has nothing to do with promoting the game.
A clear distinction. So give me a sense then, when you heard from Bill Cox and his ideations of what a professional league would look like, right? His was not the only one, right? It seems like obviously he would have had a tremendous head start given that international experience, in the years prior to '67. But there were three, I think, actual groups of moneyed individuals that were all circling around this newly hot proposition post '66 to start a professional league. Maybe I'd love to hear your sort of perceptions of that all of a suddenness, I guess, of interest to launch leagues, and three of them at that.
Well, there was the World Cup of '66. One game was televised, maybe more than one game, and I'm aware of the fact that there was some television, and there was a lot of publicity given to that game compared to the complete ignorance offered in the past. And the International Soccer League, I don't know what their crowds were, but even though I attended a number of their games, but they were respectable. The problem, I think, emerged long before I actually set foot in this country to take the job, was that Bill and some of the other owners did not respect each other too much. And the first job I was offered was as a publicity director for the Hartford Mules, which was to be owned by Bill Cox, whom I knew better than any of the others. And you may say to yourself, well, don't remember the Hartford Mules. The reason you don't remember the Hartford Mules is that Bill never got the money for it, and so that club never existed. And that first job I was offered disappeared one night. Bill, poor Bill, whose idea was for financial reasons that are, complete mystery to me, just that he and the other people didn't get on. The other people didn't get on with each other. And so one bunch of people formed the National Professional Soccer League, where you signed your own players and you were your own club. And the other mob, United Soccer Association or whatever it was called, invited foreign teams in to play in their cities as their own team. I forget the names and who they were, but I remember Cleveland brought in Stoke City from the English First Division and called themselves the Cleveland Stokers, and other people did similar things. And at the end of the first year, that obviously was an idea that could not be repeated too often, didn't do much good. And so the two leagues merged, became the North American Soccer League, and started on that journey.
Well, so
all the ownership ramifications I cannot explain, and because I don't know, because part of the time I wasn't here. In any case, I wasn't an owner. In any case, I couldn't understand what the devil half these people were talking about.
Well, all right. So give me a sense then of the NPSL. So you were recruited essentially to be the general manager of the Baltimore Bays of '67, right? Which was the first year of the NPSL, obviously competing against the USA.
Right.
And maybe a bit of an explanation or an understanding of how you saw the league. I mean, it was clearly the league that had a national television contract, right? But it was also at the same time, right, the one that did not have the official, for what it's worth, but clearly we found out it is worth something, FIFA blessing to play. I'm really curious to hear your, I don't know, some remembrances of what sort of running a team in one of these two now professional leagues in Baltimore. And it's interesting, too, the owner, I guess, was sort of a beer baron, right? Gerald Hofberger.
Yeah, that's
curious
right.
as to the dynamics of that team that year.
Well, I mean, the huge difference between the NPSL and that other mob is that we were signing our own players. We were playing our own team. We were out promoting the game and promoting our players in the local communities. We were signing players from the local communities when we could find them that were any good. And we had our feet firmly entrenched in the city in which we were building the team. The other mob arrived, played, and left again. And in some instances, we did quite well. In some, we did appallingly. But I mean, we had decent crowds in Baltimore. I forget what they were, but we used to get a lot of publicity about the game. We used to go out, our players and coaches would go out and help people coach and help people play, kids play, and all the rest of it. And we were there to not just develop our team, but to help develop the game. And some of us in some other cities were able to do that, and some simply were not. But at the end of the first year of the NASL, the animosity and stupidity which existed among some of the ownership groups, and I can't honestly remember who were the worst, because we had really bad ones still to come. But they helped bring the NASL almost to extinction. And so I left the Baltimore Bays, and Phil Woosnam left the Atlanta Chiefs, and we set up the NASL office in the visitors' locker room at Atlanta Stadium, and off we went to try and build the league, keep it in business, and build it, which we did, with great help from some of the ownership. Atlanta for one, Lamar Hunt in Dallas for another one. One of my jobs was to go out and try and persuade various people in various cities who'd expressed some interest in soccer to increase that interest and join us. And once I'd enticed them enough to feel that there was a chance there, then Lamar would join me. And so here was the Texan billionaire and the penniless Brit going out together, sharing economy class flights and sharing a room in a rundown motel to save money for the league, talking to people and trying to get them into the league, which we were able to do, so that the league did increase, did keep on growing. And one of our tasks, of course, was to do something in New York. And by chance, we found the ownership for New York, and that's what happened to the Cosmos.
All right. Well, so before we get to the Cosmos, though, you're glossing over it a little bit. I just want to the dark days of the NASL, right? So after '67 with the two leagues, and then '68, which was arguably the better shot to have one united league together. 1969, 1970, maybe even a little 71, probably the darkest days of that league, right? Because you were down to, I think, 5 teams, at least on paper. I suspect that there were weeks or days where it might have even been less than that. I just a little bit of insight into sort of those dark days. I think that there hasn't been a lot of discussion, or at least stories that I've sort of been able to unearth that kind of really speak to just how grave, if you will, the situation was.
It was one breath away from death. I mean, that's for sure. As I say, the entire league office was Phil Woosnam and myself. The vast space we had was the visitors' locker room in Atlanta Stadium with 2 desks and 2 telephones. And we had 5 clubs. We did whatever we could to keep something going, and rushed around and managed to do it, and managed to persuade 1 or 2 people who were in some other league, the American Soccer League. I mean, my memory fails when I come to these horror stories. but we managed to persuade them to Rochester, for example, the Rochester Lancers, managed to persuade them to come and join us, and suddenly we survived. And 71 came. We found ownership for New York, and so the league, we managed to have an office and a secretary to help fill Woosnam. And I left the league office and took over the New York task.
Well, so the question before we get to New York. So,
yeah,
I guess the question is, why continue? What was the rationale behind when things were really quite dire, right? Because in many respects, right, you think about it, right? You if you think about this period of time, right, you've gone from, the United States has gone from a period where you had no fewer than 3 actual ownership groups looking to start and establish leagues, and 3 years later, literally, it would be hard to argue that felt or could feel like rejection, like the patient is rejecting the transplant, if you will, of the sport.
No, you have to understand. No. You're not talking about rejection of the game. You're talking about rejection of each other's. They could not, there were so many, could not stand each other. No, we want to do it this way. No, we want to do it that way. No, we want to do it some other way. To the devil with you. I mean, we had a bunch of idiots floating around who just didn't know what the devil they were talking about, and didn't like each other in many cases, and that was it. So it had nothing to do with the game. It had everything to do with that we survived because of good owners, and we were in those dreadful days because of a bunch of idiots.
That's interesting, because I think it's really interesting and important to understand or hear sort of the belief in the sport, the game itself, if only done in a more traditional or professional and or well-reasoned and well thought out manner. And it seems to me like you're saying that a lot of it had to do with sort of greed, avarice, disagreement, and people getting in the way of each other versus the quality and the sanctity of this.
Listen, I'm not sure how many of the silly devils actually ever saw a game. They just there's something exciting. What was that on television? Oh, Charlie down the road says he wants a club. Oh, let's get in. I mean, I didn't meet all of them, but I mean, I met a number of them, and by goodness me, am I glad I had nothing to do with them. And we had a few like that later in the whole thing, which caused eventually the decline. So I mean, ownership is a very important factor, and if they are prepared to be serious about it, you can do something. If they're idiots, I mean, the mob that owned Philadelphia later in the day, a bunch of British rock stars, I forget their name, but superstars. I mean, for heaven's sake, what a complete fiasco they ran the club with. So, I mean, the idiocy of ownership is a major factor in those dark days, as you call it, of the, whatever it was, the late 60s. We had some good owners, and they're the ones who were still around when we reached a level of success. And then ownership came again, in my opinion, and destroyed the NASL after we had built so much towards the future of the game.
All right. Well, let's we'll come back to that one, right? That we'll put a push pin on that one, because clearly the ownership issues will not go away and be very interesting in the later years. But maybe some background then on I'm going to assume the importance long term or eventually of having a franchise in New York, and maybe a little bit of understanding as to perhaps how this Cosmos thing came about in the first place circa 1971.
Well, whether it was good or bad, the decisions that were made to rebuild and keep the league going were made by Phil Woosnam and myself. And we reached a number of conclusions when we were sitting in that locker room that New York was vital. We had to find the right owners who had the right amount of money, and at least owners who had the right amount of money who would hire me to run the club, and that Phil would run the league, and that we needed to start to build to get the World Cup hosted in the United States, and we needed to get Pelé. The two big things were the World Cup and Pelé, starting with the growth of the league in New York, etc. So we worked on those things and found the ownership in New York completely by chance. I don't know if you remember the name David Frost, who was a big TV personality in the UK.
Certainly.
And also became so in the United States. I think he was big interviewing Richard Nixon, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I used to do a lot of work on the BBC, including a talk show with David Frost. And I thought, well, he must have got some money. Let's go and I don't know any Americans. I don't know any American millionaires. So let me try David Frost. And his lawyer said, oh, he's interested, but he doesn't have that kind of money. You should speak to Nestle Erdogan. So I said, oh, yeah, who's Nestle Erdogan? So he explained that Nestle was music, Atlantic Records, and Warner Communications, and big soccer fan. And we said, okay, how do we pin him down? And by chance, Phil Woosnam was went to the World Cup in Mexico in 70 and attended a number of functions. And one of the functions, he was introduced to Nestle Erdogan. So Phil, as I've said in my book, Phil didn't miss that open goal. He grabbed Nestle and talked to him, persuaded him. And before you know it, we had the ownership for New York. And before you know it, I was general manager of the New York, and we had to find a name, and I made myself unpopular with the owners because I came up with the name Cosmos. And Nestle and Ahmed, his brother in the music business, wanted to call the club the New York Blues, and I thought that had nothing to offer. And somebody else said, oh, get some publicity, call the team the New York Lovers, and have pink uniforms and whatever. And so I concocted a competition to name the club and forged some applicants and came up with the name Cosmos, which is the one that I wanted. So that's how we became the Cosmos.
So a little bit of trivia here, or a little bit of a deeper into this. So we had Waylon Moore on a number of months ago, who was the artist, I think, who was
the Cosmos logo.
Indeed. So, and I think he was a little uncertain as to sort of how the name sort of truly came about. Now, I've seen or heard, and again, the internet's a crazy thing, right? So you trust it as far as you can throw it, right? But, what the name of the Cosmos, right? Was that the specific name, or was it, I heard Cosmopolitans, and it was a shortening of that, a la the New York Mets? What was sort of the
very okay. Listen, it was my thinking to come up with a name. The previous professional sports team to emerge in New York were the Mets, and their full name was Metropolitans, right? So I thought, now, what can I do to best that? Well, Cosmopolitan is bigger than Metropolitan, and I can shorten Cosmopolitan to Cosmos, and what's bigger than the Cosmos? That's it, the biggest thing you can possibly do. So I said Cosmos. Then, to get agreement, I had a competition in which I asked people to name the club, crossing my fingers that someone would come up with the name Cosmos, and I could then tell the ownership, look, sorry, not the Blues, not the whatever, we got some of our fans come up with a name. And two high school teachers in Queens, I don't remember their names, sent the letter in saying Cosmos. So, boom, that's it. I got a few friends to write a few other letters to support Cosmos. I remember opening the mail. It was at an executive committee meeting of the United States Soccer Federation, and I was so excited, so pleased when someone said Cosmos that Gene Edwards, the president, said, do you think you can stop opening the mail now? We can get on with the meeting. Now you know what you want to call a stupid club. So I said, yes. So that's how the Cosmos came about. That's where the mixture of Cosmos and Cosmopolitan came about. All my fault, and into the public view because of those two high school teachers in Queens who had the same idea.
Whose names, by the way, according to my research, are Meyer Diller and Al Capelli, and they were at Martin Van Buren High School in Queens. So that's an interesting little story. So
that's the two. If that's the names I said so long ago, I can't remember the names, but by heavens, those were the two high school teachers in Queens who came up with a name that helped me do that.
Very interesting. Well, I'm glad you set that sort of myth to rest. That helps a lot, I think, in the and it's partially why we do this, right? Because a lot of this is oral history, things that elude us in terms of certainty. All right, so okay, so late 70, early 71, you are now thrust into this this new situation, a New York team in a league that's still not quite resuscitated yet, shall we say? Give us some insight as to your first days and how you were, shall we say, managing upward with this literally rock star ownership group.
Well, fortunately, I had very little to do with the ownership group. They relegated conversation with me to very nice fellow who was only with them a year. I don't know. He wasn't at the top rank of Warner, maybe the second or third rank. I don't know. I had no problems with dealing with them. I was left to myself to do whatever. So I did whatever and found the right coach and to a certain extent the right players through the coach, Gordon Bradley. And we worked at building the game, building the name, as well as obviously building our attendance. We did so much work in the area. We used to have a thing called the Cosmos Coaches Corner, and we sent, Gordon started it, and then we sent players out every night into areas, into people's homes where they got the local coaches in, or into a bar or wherever, to talk about the Cosmos, to talk about soccer to the people who already had some interest or could be persuaded to have some interest, which is why you ended up with signs all over the place after a few years, Cosmos Country. Well, that's what it was, Cosmos Country. And the cartoonist in the Daily News had this cartoon, which I wish I'd kept a copy of it, which showed two seats in a locker room, and one of them was large, and there was an American football on it, and next was this thin little thing with a soccer ball on it, and then the next one was they were closer to the same size, and the next one they were the same size, and the next one, the American football is 2 inches, and the soccer ball is 8 inches. So that was the way people felt at that time that we had developed. I'm not saying we overtook the football teams there in every respect, but by heavens, we were there.
So Yankee Stadium, right? That was the starting point, right? So you're thinking big, and it sounds like you're not getting too much interference, shall we say, from the ownership groups, right? So a little bit of overwhelmed or underwhelmed. Is Yankee Stadium the right place to play? And Gordon Bradley, right? He had played with the New York Generals of, was that the NPSL? Yes, they were part of the NPSL. So he had a little bit of familiarity with sort of what the on-field, performance would or could look like.
Well, no, I mean, Gordon had played before all over the place and was playing and coaching in the German-American League, which was the strongest local ethnic league. He played and coached New York Hota, one of their best teams, because I wasn't going overseas to find the first people. I wanted to get into those ethnic leagues that existed in New York and steal the best from there, and got enormous help from the German-American League, which changed its name to the Cosmopolitan League after they became well associated with us. So I had to get people. I didn't know New York, and I didn't know the soccer people in New York. I became knowledgeable of the soccer people, but I needed knowledge locally. Gordon was the perfect mix as the local knowledge, local contacts, and a good coach, and a very hard worker. So that's what we got, a bunch of hard workers who really went out not just to build the Cosmos, but to build the knowledge of the game. And we ended up, I think it was every Tuesday, I think, we had arranged to go, we'd find a high school somewhere which had a beautiful field and all the rest of it, and work out the details with the high school that we were going to train on Tuesday morning on their field, and all classes would be abandoned for 2 hours, and all the kids and everybody would sit there and watch the Cosmos train and get autographs and that kind of stuff. I mean, that's one of the many things we did. I used to say, we don't expect you to come and see us, pay to see us, until we've been to see you. And therefore, we would go and see you and make the speeches or make the coaching or do whatever was necessary to get to the Greek Americans, the German Americans, the American Americans, the whatever Americans, and tell them about the Cosmos and about soccer.
So this is grassroots, right? This is a complete 180, right, from what the ambitious owners of the previous leagues and teams, right, were doing, which is more, not that, right, not growing the roots, so to speak, right? This seems like it's very involve the community kind of approach.
No. I mean, the NPSL, the clubs that existed from the NPSL and converted to the NASL and stayed, they to a degree were doing the same kind of thing. The U.S., whatever it was called, the other mob who imported foreign teams, didn't have a clue. And I don't know if any of them, maybe one or two of them, ended up common sense and joined the NASL. But it was a totally different approach to the whole thing. We were trying to build the game of soccer and doing so by having a league and having people employed to run a club and to promote the game in their territory and anywhere else if they could. I mean, it was quite simple.
But it didn't necessarily translate into huge crowds, right? Either at Yankee Stadium, I mean, by the end of that first season, right, you were already looking at...
Well, listen, why would it translate into huge crowds? I mean, people were still saying, what's soccer? Oh, what's the World Cup? Oh, what's our national team? I mean, soccer was not here. It may have visited, and it may have been in the clutches and minds and hearts of ethnic groups, but it wasn't here. And what had to be done was to build the game while building clubs and using the clubs and their personnel to build the game. And that worked where it worked, and it didn't work where ownership disagreed.
Interesting. So then, okay, so Yankee Stadium, right? You're there, but so the move to Hofstra, right, for the next 2 seasons, was that because Yankee Stadium was largely too large and or not drawing? Was it because of the, I guess, pending, or I guess it was approaching renovation? Or were you maybe sort of saying, look, maybe we need to take a step back and be a little bit more intimate, I guess, perhaps in our settings before we kind of grow bigger than continue to Yankee Stadium?
No. The problem with Yankee Stadium was that they didn't want us playing if the field was wet. So therefore, there's a regulation. I forget what the time was for a Saturday or Sunday game, but if there's an evening kickoff at 7 o'clock, if it rained, they had the right to cancel the game anytime up until 4 o'clock on the day we had a game kicking off at 7 o'clock. Now, how many seasons can you stick and doing that, knowing that people may be turning up and they turn up and find, oh, well, it isn't raining, but it was, and the Yankees said we can't play. I mean, a totally ridiculous thing, but there was no way of avoiding it because that was the first year, and then they kept on pushing that. So got to get out of Yankee Stadium. We're not playing at a blasted baseball field anymore. And Hofstra seemed the right place, stayed the right place until Giant Stadium was in the offing. And so I moved into Randall's Island then so that we were not trying to move all the way from Long Island to New Jersey, so to speak. And so that's when we played at Randall's Island, and that's when other things happened, including Pelé, and then Giant Stadium, and away we went.
All right, so you're saying that the Giant Stadium thing was already a glint in your eye in the mid-'70s, even before you had moved to Downing Stadium from Hofstra.
Well, I mean, I can't remember what the sequence was, but once I knew Giant Stadium was being built, then that was the place I knew we had to go. But I can't remember what day it was that I thought that, but it was bloody obvious, particularly Sonny Werblin, who was responsible for the place, had decided that the field would be wide enough for soccer, not like most American football stadiums, where their game is a narrower field, and so therefore we had to play on a narrower field. But Sonny Werblin had the idea that, there's going to be soccer crowds, so let's build Giant Stadium wide enough for a real full-size soccer field. And so with that knowledge as well, and the belief in my mind that we were going to have Pelé and big crowds, that was the obvious place to think about.
All right, let's get some sense of then as you're moving into Randall's Island and Downing Stadium, and I charitably, I was decrepit, but it was certainly not necessarily the highest order stadium. Obviously, it had some appeal, right? Because as did the WFL World Football League team, the New York Stars, right? See, at least it's close to Manhattan. It's interestingly located, somewhat centrally, but arguably very difficult to get to. Maybe some sense of those years, and then as part of that, this Pelé thing, because you've already mentioned the potential pursuit of him in the first place. But I get the sense that the idea of Pelé, right, especially one who has been here previous in years prior with lots of different Santos visits in international matches, ISL included, that this was almost perhaps part of the process, maybe even when the Cosmos was formed, that Pelé would ultimately at least be given a fair shot to be brought to the United States. Is that correct?
No. Stupid or not, there are things that Phil and I decided had to happen, and we would do our best to make them happen. Getting the World Cup in the country was one thing. Getting Pelé playing in New York was another thing. So all those things were not just, what about this? We had it, we had it written down, so to speak. This is what we're going to do. And this is what we will try to do. And this is what we did. So it wasn't any question of, all right, well now, maybe we'll get Pelé, so maybe we should have a bigger stadium. The whole thing was the rubbish that Phil and I came up with in whatever years it was when we were running the league. And we had support for those ideas from some people, and we had laughter and ridicule from some people for those ideas, but those are the ideas that we had. And, good, bad, or indifferent, we are the ones who decided that's what we want to do, and that's what we will try and do. And I say the idea was that Phil would run the league, and I would run New York, and we managed to make it work for a while.
Well, look, in '74, right, the league actually was quite on the ascendance, right? I mean, you had teams out in San Jose, and you had Tampa Bay starting to come into play, and obviously some other markets. This is even before the arrival of Pelé, right? So there were clearly some green shoots going on across the league, if not necessarily New York proper per se, but it had to give you some hope that, that sticking to the game plan here and maybe adding in some of these pieces long dreamt, such as a Pelé, would perhaps grow to some real stature and size, given where you were a few years prior.
Not would, perhaps, but would, of course. We were making progress, not in every single city, but very much making progress. And then decisions were made to get rid of Phil Woosnam, which was a mistake. And he was replaced by a person who did not know anything about what had happened, did not know anything about what should happen, did not know anything about anything, and was a destructive force beyond measure.
Interesting. So maybe Pelé. Let's talk about the pursuit, right? Obviously, the documentary sort of got into it a bit, but you were obviously very much enmeshed in this long-term pursuit of the world's greatest player. Maybe a little bit of insight, a little bit of intrigue as to it wasn't a straight line to get him, was it?
No, I mean it was simple in the sense that he had to be persuaded to come to America because he still had a contract with Santos. It was coming to an end. They, of course, would have pushed another contract in front of him. They were very sad that he was leaving. And Juventus in Italy and Real Madrid in Spain were both interested in him. And he didn't have an agent. And so if you wanted to talk about him, you talk to him about him. And so shortly after the Cosmos were founded, early 71, Brazil, or maybe in Santos, I forget, if it was the club or the national team, were playing in Kingston, Jamaica. And as that's a lot closer than Santos, I hopped on a plane down to Jamaica with Kurt Lamb, who was the general secretary of the federation then, very nice, helpful fellow, big soccer fan, who had known Pelé personally for some time. And I didn't know Pelé personally. I knew him. I'd seen him many times, but he didn't know me. And so Kurt went with me and introduced me, and I talked to Pelé in Kingston and said, we're building the game in America, and I want you, et cetera, et cetera. And as I found out afterwards, he said to Giroud Matzé, who was their physio and became Pelé's guide, you might say, what the devil is he talking about? Or words to that effect. So, but at least he knew me then. And then the Santos played an exhibition game against America, or one of the teams from Cali in Colombia, Deportivo Cali, I think it was. And before the game, I went on the field with Pelé and retired the Cosmos number 10 shirt and gave him a Cosmos number 10 shirt and say, you'll wear this one day. And we had a big laugh. And from then on, I pestered him to death wherever I had the time to go and talk to him. And it got better and better as time went on. And we finally, in Brussels, he was playing in a testimonial game for Paul van Himst, the Belgian coach, national coach. And we finally got down to it where he said, okay, I will play. And so we signed a few rough pieces of paper. In fact, I pulled a piece of notepaper out from the drawer of the hotel, the GB Motor Inn in Brussels. And Pelé scrolled on it and signed it. And I said, okay, I'll meet you again in 2 weeks' time. He had to go somewhere for some other thing. And we agreed to meet in Rome a couple of weeks' time. And I went back home and got contracts, etc., and went back to Rome and got a bit further and went to Santos. I often think I should have bought a season ticket to get on the plane to Brazil, because I went there so many times. But altogether, then it was done. He agreed. We met in Bermuda and signed all the contracts, and 2 days later caused chaos at Club 21 when we had the press conference.
It was chaos. I've seen some footage and some snapshots of that. But yeah. Any memories of that? Because it seems like everybody in the world, literally and figuratively, for the press showed up. And although Pelé was a little late too, I think, right?
I don't know if he was or not. I mean, those days were utter, absolute chaos. 1 minute we're a club, we're doing all right, considering, and the next day we're nothing bigger in the world than Pelé, and we still only had 2 or 3 people running the club. I didn't have a great staff to do things. We were doing everything ourselves. I mean, sometimes when we had a big crowd, I used to have to grab tickets from the ticket office and stand outside and sell people tickets to stop the lines becoming too long. I mean, we had 2 or 3 people running the whole blasted thing. And I knew we were going to have a decent showing at the press conference, but I wanted it at somewhere like Club 21, because that was upscale New York rather than downscale New York, which is where the game had been always. But I had no idea we're going to get that many. I mean, it was mob scene, absolute mob scene. So as it was a few days later when he played his first game.
All right, so let's talk about that first game, because we had Kyle Rote Jr. on a number of months ago, and I quizzed him on what I tried to piece together was sort of a bit of the history of that first game, because it's my understanding, and I think mostly corroborated by Kyle, was this. So it was an exhibition game. It was I wouldn't call it hastily arranged, but it seems like it was in retrospect. CBS, right, a national live broadcast, right, which was quite something. But my understanding was that Dallas had a game literally that night before in San Antonio, and it had to be in New York, like for a 2:00 game for a nationally televised audience at that, to introduce Pelé. It boggles my mind, and obviously, this is years later, right? So in hindsight, but that you'd be able to schedule an exhibition game in the middle of the NASL season, get a CBS to drop everything or somehow squeeze it in. I must imagine that not only the signing of Pelé itself, but the days before and the days during getting him here must have been just not only chaos, but just completely uncharted craziness to get that all together.
Well, I think that I probably worked about 48 hours a day in that period. Things had to be done. There was very few of us to do it, but we did it. And I don't recall Dallas having to play in San Antonio. I have no idea, but I do know that we didn't have a game that weekend. And with Pelé, we had to have a game that weekend to start the whole process. And I arranged, Dallas agreed to play and did play. Within a day or so, not only did we get TV, but we had sponsors who wanted to put their signs on the field. They came out of the blue and had to negotiate those deals. And there were so many things that had to be done to get us from being, minor league to the biggest thing there was for a day. So it was fairly chaotic, yes.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. Okay, so there's another sort of rumor floating around there, and I don't know where this sort of came about in our conversations in this podcast, but maybe you could either put this to rest or corroborate it. Was there, to your knowledge, any kind of sort of agreement amongst the league or the league clubs or owners to help subsidize this big contract of Pelé's beyond what Warner Communications, the owner, was putting together? That is sort of a take one for the league kind of thing to help get Pelé here and share the wealth, so to speak.
It's quite simple. I did a deal with the league that if Pelé played in their home game, I mean, if he was injured or whatever, it didn't count, but that we would get a percentage of the difference in their regular home gates and their gate for the Pelé game. So, if somebody got 10,000 normally and 50,000 for Pelé, we'd get, I think it was 15, could have been 10% or 15% of the difference of the gate revenue between their poor crowd and their Pelé crowd. That's the help that we got to finance Pelé.
Interesting. So it wasn't a check ahead of time. It was a performance guarantee or percentage of the time he was with the.
Yeah, the clubs, they agreed. Here's what we normally get, and here's what we got when you were there, and here's your percentage of it. Quite simple.
At what point, when Pelé sort of brings it, obviously, and a lot of people sort of look back and sort of say, well, it was an immediate, catalyst to, obviously success in crowds in New York, certainly, and the league itself. But it's true. I mean, you look at it; it's almost like a direct line. I mean, the attention and then the curiosity, right? It's almost overnight in that respect. At what point? I mean, this is by '76. You're back in Yankee Stadium, so you can accommodate some larger crowds. And then obviously you're on your way to Giant Stadium circa 77. But at what point did you and Steve Ross, the Erdigans, the management, overall everybody involved with the team, it feels to me like it was an inflection point of some substance, right? That also begat the notion, the idea that Pelé probably the beginning of this pursuit of quality talent, not the end of it.
There came a major difference of opinion. I signed Beckenbauer over the objections of some of the owners because I wanted him to be the last foreign player I signed, because he was such a complete player on the field that I wanted a whole more and more young Americans to come on, and I felt that we could do quite well with the number of Americans who were beginning to show talent, and Pelé there to play in the middle of the field and control everything. But the signing then at the urging of Steve Ross, the signing of Quinaglia, and then somebody else wanted, that's right, the Erdigans wanted a Turkish player, and so we ended up signing Turkish goalkeeper and had a mass of limousines leading 75 Rockefeller Plaza with ownership and everybody on board, going down to the helicopter port and flying by helicopter across the Giant Stadium to discuss the goalkeeper situation, the Turkish guy or Shep Messing, should he play on this weekend? And we wanted Shep Messing the whole time, and most of the time Gordon Bradley and I won. But the owners were getting, because of the success, were getting more and more interested and more involved and more stupid. So that was that.
So I get the sense, reading from some of the Steve Ross biographies and stuff, that ultimately he kind of, and like a lot of owners in various fledgling and or challenger leagues of the time, and it's very historical. It almost feels like this was his NFL team at some point. And perhaps some of the opulence or the big timeness of this was maybe sort of, did you get a sense that this was sort of his dream, this is him playing out his desire to be an NFL owner or a major I guess, professional sports league in the United States owner, and then that perhaps with the signing of Pelé and this sort of growing into something maybe significant, that this was sort of his way of doing that? Or am I putting words in your mouth here?
Well, I mean, there's no question that he suddenly wanted to be prominent in whatever was happening. I mean, I recall him when we moved to Giant Stadium, which he didn't want because there was no subway to Giant Stadium, he said. But when we got to Giant Stadium and it worked, he was full of praise for himself that we'd gone to Giant Stadium. So, we had a bunch of owners who sort of were in the background, but suddenly wanted to be in the foreground. And it wasn't just Steve Ross, it was the Erdigans, and with Steve Ross's great friend, Kinalia, and that was it.
So maybe some sense of the 77 season, right? Because it's clear that you've been helping architect this team from where it's very modest beginnings, right? And obviously from the league office itself to, shall we say, the precipice of, I don't know, superstardom. You cannot underestimate. And clearly the story of the Cosmos has been talked about quite a bit, but I think there's a whole generation of fans who just don't. You cannot underestimate how comet-like this team was in the mid to late 1970s, not just on the New York sports scene, but just on the national sports and certainly national soccer scene, the international scene, especially in the sport of soccer.
Sure.
Right? I mean, did you at what point, say maybe in 77, when you're there at Giant Stadium starting to see some of these gigantic crowds, at what point did you was there any time that you sort of took great pride of like, wow, look how far we've come? And then maybe at the same time say, wow, where is this going to go? And maybe not necessarily in a good way? Or were you just sort of caught up in the moment?
No, well, as I mentioned just now, I knew where it was going to go if I was making the decisions. It was going to be the first NASL team to have a majority of American talent on the field at every game and doing extremely well and helping build a national team. That's what I wanted. But because of the stage we reached, the ownership wanted more and more and more and more stars. As Ahmed, I think it was, said at one time, they wanted the number one player from each country in the world, which was absolutely opposite to what I wanted to do. And I mean, I remember once somebody saying to me, look, you better pop up and see Nestle because he wants to talk about who to sign for next year. Oh, all right then. So I went up and I said, oh, these are some of the players. Here's a list of half a dozen players I've been talking to and thinking about. And he looked at the list, didn't say anything. He said, sign him, him, and him. And I looked and I said, well, the only problem with that, Nestle, is all three of them are left backs. And we don't exactly need three left backs. So that was another item of building my total unpopularity with the ownership. And their ideas were just totally different than mine. And it was my ideas that got us there, but my future ideas were absolutely opposed to theirs.
So, if I may be so bold, how did it sort of come to an end? This is in the 77 season, I guess, that you essentially left. I wonder if it was similar to around when Gordon Bradley left the team as well and was replaced. And I mean, it seemed kind of all of a sudden for somebody who followed the team early in 77 to see. Right. I'm curious to hear that back.
It was all part of what I've just explained, where ownership suddenly wanted to make decisions. It was explained to me one day that the ownership was upset that they didn't get enough publicity and enough thanks for what they were doing. Well, they weren't exactly there at Randall's Island to see what we were doing. So the thing developed to where they wanted to make decisions. They wanted to make decisions about the coaching, about the players, about everything, even though they hadn't got a bloody clue. So they said to me one day, look, we've had enough. And so I departed.
Was that in the middle of the season? Was this before, the playoffs and the Soccer Bowl?
Before the playoffs, yeah.
Okay, so that must have left you, I don't know, I would say bitter, but certainly miffed. No?
Well, to talk about them is difficult because there may be women and children listening to this program, so I have to be careful what I say, what words I choose. It was a disgusting way they behaved. They were totally useless in terms of what they wanted to do, and their attitude to the people who'd built the club, not just me, but Gordon Bradley as well, was despicable. And I'm only sorry that they're dead, passed away, because you shouldn't speak such ill of dead people. But it's a fact. Those who built the club were dismissed.
And I would assume the feelings of bittersweetness, right, when that gigantic crowd in the playoffs at Giant Stadium, the world's the largest in the U.S. at that point, the Soccer Bowl championship. That's all your handiwork, right? And to not be around literally in the midst of it as that's happening, it's got to feel a little sort of sad. And
there was another occasion I recall when I was running the Toronto club when we won 4-1 at Giant Stadium against the Cosmos. I remember that very well. The Chicago, we reached Soccer Bowl once, if not once. Toronto, we reached it twice. So, after I left the Cosmos, the clubs I was running got that far, and we often beat the Cosmos, and the Cosmos were a shambles. But, bitter, you said, miffed, bitterly angry, if I want to think about it, and if I want to give you the right words.
So where was Phil Woosnam in all of this, right? So, obviously you had been with him.
You see, Phil wasn't there anymore, because one day Nesby was out walking along the street and bumped into a guy he knew, a fellow called Howard Samuels, who had been a failed candidate for a New York governor, I think it was, or New York Senate or something or other. And before you know it, Phil Woosnam, who has contributed greatly to the building of the league, is out, and Howard Samuels is the new president of the league. And he is the guy I referred to earlier. I don't think he knew the shape of a soccer ball. And he was hopeless would-be praise.
Well, that's in the early days. I was curious sort of where. So Phil was still very much involved at your time when you were leaving the Cosmos and then going.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So I guess I was just sort of I guess this is sort of my little attempt at a segue to get into. So it seems to me that maybe obviously the relationship with Phil and you were strong, obviously from the earliest days. But I guess when you were, shall we say, departing the Cosmos, what was Phil's opinion about that move, or was he now possibly, my interpretation, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps getting, shall we say, caught up in the success of this too, not unlike, say, the Cosmos?
No, Phil thought it was ridiculous.
Okay.
But there was nothing he could do about it, and he was starting to get lots of problems that hasn't existed before, and it was only 5 minutes before I started getting offers to run other clubs. So, Phil didn't get involved. I didn't ask Phil to get involved, and he couldn't have done anything if he did get involved.
How did the sting come about? What obviously you would be perceived to being a very hot, I would argue, commodity, given what you had done from the earliest days, building up what was arguably now maybe the most, certainly the glamour club, or the beginnings of the glamour club of the NASL. I suspect Lee Stern probably saw you from afar. And how did that Chicago Sting relationship come about for
Lee, I knew Lee quite well because, I was on all kinds of committees and Lee was, and so we'd met and we'd had arguments and whatever, but I, met him scores of times and he just gave me a call and said, what about it? And so that's what happened.
And what of the Sting? Very interesting. Lee is on our list. We've been touching base with his folks, and hopefully we're going to have him on an episode in the coming weeks. But was this so 78, 79? Were you splitting time between Wrigley Field and Comiskey, or had you been at Soldier Field?
Oh, that
different market, right?
That was dreadful when we had to play playing two stadiums the same season. That was awful. The hiring Willie Roy as a coach was one of the few good decisions I made in Chicago. He did a good job, recruited some good players. But got two stadiums, plus then we were, because of somebody else in the league, we were going to have indoor soccer as well, or did have indoor soccer. And the Sting were going to play in some beautiful brand new arena. And something went wrong with the arena. It fell down or couldn't be used. And so there was another playing problem for the Sting, and I just couldn't stand it. So I let Lee carry on and ended up a few weeks later taking the Toronto job, which was a bit easier. But funny thing is that about last year, I got an email from Lee saying that he'd just come across some Sting tickets from when I was running the club, and that they were $1 for kids and $3 for adults. And how did I expect to fill Soldier Field charging such huge, horrendous prices for a Sting game? So I replied and said, well, as you haven't paid, that's what you're fired. So as I replied and said, as you haven't paid me since 1979, that's about $30 million you owe me. And so he replied and said, no problem, I'll wire it as soon as I find out how much of your expenses went on Cuban cigars.
Well,
we had a good laugh at that.
Before we leave the Sting, because 79 obviously was a pretty successful season. It seemed to me that the Sting kind of really became one of the better sides in the league.
Yep.
And you cannot argue that, the Sting certainly, Lee Stern had been with that team. He's probably the longest lasting owners, right? And to what financial detriment, right? But it's certainly, now living in Chicago as I do now, it is amazing to me how many people have fond memories, even if they weren't alive at the time, of this club. It was the logo, or people like, Coach Willie Roy or Karl-Heinz Granitza. Certainly, I suspect you were part of that, him coming to that franchise, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, that's good. We did a decent job there in a couple of years that I was there, and they carried on doing a decent job. So that's the way it went with several clubs.
All right. How does Toronto happen? And I'm really curious because by 1980, when you joined them as president, general manager, I don't know what the official title was, but the head honcho. Whatever. Toronto had at the time a very interesting and somewhat torturous history with the NASL, right? Because, when they won the championship in 76, right, they were known as the Toronto Metros Croatia.
Sure.
Which I'm sure was based on my readings, was something that Phil was in particular not too happy about, having sort of that ethnic relationship, but it was kind of a lifeline for that club to keep it there in the city at that time, which he needed, right?
That's right. And suddenly, out of the blue, I had nothing to do with it, that I can recall. Out of the blue came these TV people. I should remember their names, but I don't. Who bought the club from Croatian owners, and then gave me a call and said, "Oi, you fancy coming to Canada?" So as they were changing the name to the Blizzard, and I liked Toronto, it was a nice place, and they had Cuban cigars there, which they didn't in the United States. So I took that job, and we did quite well.
So that was the Global Television Network. So there's a picture, and I'm trying to remember. It was trying to remember some of the players that were featured in the picture. And I don't know if it was the first season as the Blizzard or the second. And I don't know if it was, I just don't remember. I will find it and I will email it to you. But do you remember a game in the early part of one of those first seasons, either 80 or 81, where it was actually snowing? Almost.
Oh, sure.
proverbial?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It was, in fact, if my memory is correct, it wasn't snowing before the game or in the first half, but when the players came out for the second half, it was pouring down.
Yeah, it's a great picture, and I will post it when we post this.
Yeah, no, oh no, absolutely, it was snowing. It was the perfect welcome for the blizzard.
That's hilarious. So, all right, so give me a sense then of the 1980 to 1984. You're leading the Toronto Blizzard, and you're still very much involved in the league. So, I guess I have sort of two questions in regard to that. So, one, with the New York Cosmos and all of their, shall we say, vaunted success, or at least perceived success in your rearview mirror, and having been with at least one other club and now a second club since then, I'm really curious to hear what was your perception of the league at that point in your Toronto management days? When did you sort of see things go a little, shall we say, wobbly in this sort of now 2014 league thing?
I can't say what year or precisely what, but as the days or months or years passed, a lot of unbelievably stupid decisions were made by the league. For example, the league had an executive for years, had an executive committee, which consisted of people like Lamar Hunt and I think Lee Stern and George Strawbridge in Tampa, sensible people, and me, and suddenly all these new people, because we expanded, that was it, we had an expansion, and the expansion brought in a bunch of new people who were the same kind of idiots who ruined us in the first place, because they changed this executive committee and each division had to have its person. And the people on the executive committee, I think with maybe one exception, were suddenly people who had not had 5 minutes experience in the league before. And so decisions were made that were totally ridiculous. I mentioned earlier, these idiot rock stars who owned Philadelphia, who just had no idea what they were doing. They weren't in Philadelphia. They were just somewhere where they had a team. And did a dreadful job there. We had a terrible job in Western Canada, Calgary and Edmonton, where the two people out there, one of them ended up in jail. And then the TV people in Toronto got a bit, well then, first of all, the people in Montreal, which was, the big brewers owned the club and were doing a good job, whatever the brewer was called.
I think it was Molson, right?
Molson, that's right, yes. And they quit because of the idiocy of a decision that Howard Samuels made, and they were so perturbed at the way it was made so casually that they quit. And then the TV people quit, and they sold it to a fellow called Karsten von Worseby, owned a bunch of hotels, including the York Hanover in Toronto, and was a soccer fan, German guy, hence York Hanover, York being the old name of Toronto, Hanover being where he came from in Germany. And we were doing okay, but then he got into terrible trouble. Business dealings in Bermuda and Germany and all kinds of places, and was I'm not sure if he ended up prosecuted or not, but it was bad days for him. And at that same time, the league was finding the stupidity of its expansion, because some of the expansion guys, like the idiots in Western Canada, were ruining things, and some of the good guys, like I say, Moulton in Montreal, decided they didn't want to do business with idiots, stay in business with people who were doing everything wrong. So the league started to fall to pieces again. And I had forgotten until you raised this subject. There was a meeting, I don't know which year it was now, but it's easy to find out, the year in which the league expanded to maybe 22 teams or something like that.
Yeah, 78, they went to 24 teams from, I guess it was 18.
24 teams.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. That was the expansion, which some of us were totally against, but we lost the vote, and they went to 24, and that was the beginning of the end.
So why the haste to add 6 teams in 1 year? I'm assuming, actually, and I think I've heard this, and maybe it's just one answer of a bunch, right? But television and the pursuit of such, right? That sort of having a bigger footprint to attract television versus 18 teams in 77?
Well, it may have been also the fact that the new teams were having to cough up money to join, franchise fees.
There you go.
I forget, a few million, and so it was a share. Some people wanted to share. And I do recall, unfortunately, the meeting in which the decision was made, that Steve Ross turned up for the first league meeting he never attended and spoke vociferously and endlessly about the need to expand and all the rest of it, and that's what happened. I say, and then with the executive committee being changed, the whole and Samuel's eventually coming in whenever it was to take over from Woosnam, there was basically no one left at the decision-making level who had the faintest idea what they were talking about.
So let me understand a little bit more about, and unfortunately Phil's no longer with us to hear this, and I wish I would had the opportunity in this podcast back when I first met him during the 35-year anniversary of the NASL at the old Soccer Hall of Fame in Oneonta. I did get to meet him, but would have loved to have asked him this question. From your perception, right, you're obviously very, very much involved in not only the Toronto team, but still the league operations. Maybe a little bit of you sort of give a little bit of background, but sort of what were maybe the events or the situation that sort of led to Phil's ouster and the replacement with this admittedly non-soccer guy? Did anything in particular precipitate it besides sort of the bigger issues? And when did it sort of happen and maybe why at that point? Was it 81, 82? I forget.
I honestly don't remember the specific happenings or the specific reasons. It was all part and parcel, I would say, of what had been going on, that those new to the whole thing were now making the decisions, and those who had brought the league and the game to that level were not wanted anymore. And it was commonplace.
Well, but with that, though, the soul of the entire league, right? You arguably you were a microcosm of that back in 77 when you left the Cosmos, right? It's sort of, you're responsible for basically bringing the team to that level of success, and then potentially what it goes to further, right? Phil, this is probably even a grander vision of that, right? Because without obviously a Phil Woosnam in the darkest days of this league way back when, you wouldn't even be at this arguably higher order problem of too many franchises and national television issues and that kind of stuff.
I just came across some old pieces of paper a while ago, back from 1969, when Phil and I were, as I said before, in the league office. Both of which I wrote. One was this. I wrote it because in one case I was the chairman of the publicity committee of the federation. We didn't have a committee, but I was chairman of it. And we had a meeting, Phil and Gene Edwards and whoever else was around at the time, and we decided that we were, Phil and I pushed for it, and everyone agreed we would fight over the years to get the World Cup. So that was written in 1969. Same year, I ended up writing, with input from Phil and other people, the long-range plan for the league. What we would do is several pages long, how we would develop the game and do this and do this and do this and do this. So much of the time that Phil and I were there, we were discussing things with owners like Lamar Hunt and Bob Hermann and a few others who had gone through that ridiculous early stage in some respects. Then we were talking utter nonsense as to what we were going to do in the future. And so there was that relatively clear plan as to where we're going to go until the expansion. And in fact, those who voted for the expansion, that's right. I remember, we wanted to kick some of them out of the league, but instead of that, they voted for the expansion. And so that was helping the thing on its way. But both, in my opinion, the advance from nothing to something's fairly important came about because of the plans that we had at the beginning and the support there was from a bunch of good owners, and that the whole thing almost failed to begin with and flopped at the end was because of idiot owners. And I exclude from that people like Strawbridge and Stern and Bob Hermann and Lamar Hunt and Walt Daggett and some of the others whose names escape me now. But there were a bunch of very good people. May always have differences of agreement, but they were genuine people, wanted to do a genuine thing in their cities. But some rubbish.
So speak to me about Howard Samuels and sort of the last days of the league, because obviously, I want to get a sense of sort of, you mentioned, his enormous unqualifications, I guess, for being a soccer league commissioner and then some, but maybe a little bit of, but it's also, I think it gives me, it sort of seems like a very descriptive coda, perhaps, of the league itself in its last year and days, right? Because at the end of everything, who did they turn to once Howard died, somewhat unexpectedly? It was you, right? Pretty much to kind of, pick up the pieces and see what was left, if anything, to go forward. So
the league was already dead. I had the Cosmos ownership had been passed to Canalia, and he was. We had a league meeting with the lawyers at present and all the rest of it. Went through the formalities to kick the Cosmos out of the league. In the meeting in which Canalia threatened to throw the league attorney out the window. Prior to that, I had been in Vancouver just about convincing someone to come into the league in Vancouver. When a guy came in the room we were having the meeting in and said, "Hey, look at this." And there was a AP or Reuters or whatever story that the Cosmos were going to play by themselves and do all kinds of things and weren't sure they were going to play in the league. And so the Vancouver people said, well, in that case, thanks for coming to see us, but, we don't want to talk about this anymore. So the thing was, and so another fellow from Houston was going to come in and put the Houston franchise in, and then, he didn't like the stadium, so then he went to somewhere in Georgia or Mississippi or somewhere. It was going to have a stadium, but then it didn't happen. So all this kind of stuff was happening to close it down. And it was not dissimilar to that mentality of ownership which almost finished the thing off back in the 70s.
So you were with the Blizzard 84. You came that close to winning the championship in 84, the now 3-game series called the Soccer Bowl against Chicago, your old team nemesis. And Samuels, basically by the end of the season, just shortly thereafter, dies of I think it was a heart attack, right? What had he not, passed? Did you have any positive sense at that time that maybe things could be turned around in the league, or did you think that even with his passing, or perhaps exacerbated by it, that it was just sort of inevitable even before that happened? That it was not.
Two things I would say. First of all, just one story about Howard Samuels. He came to Toronto when I was in Toronto, and we had a big meeting, the mayor of Toronto and all the people. on that wonderful, great tall tower they've got there. I forget what it's called now. So we got this 50, maybe 100 people, and Howard Sanders made the speech. I think it may have been about soccer ball or something, whatever. It was to promote us. And at the end, as his voice raised, he said, and one day the United States will win the World Cup, which, of course, was not met with tumultuous applause in Canada, but complete silence. I mean, what a...
Yeah, not a great read. Not a great read of the room, right?
I mean, just awful. People were looking around saying, "Who's this stupid idiot? If he doesn't know what bloody country he's in." So I mean, it was reported widely that he'd told everyone in Canada that the United States was going to win the World Cup one day. That did a lot of good. And your question about did I have a feeling things were going? Undoubtedly, and it in fact it had started when that expansion took place and the changes in the executive committee members and all the rest of it. It was for those who had what I would say common sense. We were all concerned. And I mentioned a bunch of owners just now who were good. I mean, they had their concerns. But now they were in a minority vote, and things were not going well.
All right. Well, a couple of things as we sort of, I guess, sort of round the corner here and get out of the NASL. So one thing that the league certainly, and that you were certainly part of course, was sort of the approach to the on-field play, right? So the rules, right? The experimentation, the 35-yard line, the shootout, the 3 North Americans on the field at all times, the points system. In retrospect, these things look like not only part of the vanguard, but frankly prescient, given sort of the sometimes morbid state of the game and frankly how some of those rules have changed since the 70s and early 80s. Maybe a bit of sense of your role in and or others' roles in the approach to, shall we say, challenging conventions with rules a bit for the American marketplace with the NASL.
I would say much of the credit for that would go to Phil Woosnam. I don't recall anybody else come up with those ideas. The idea of guaranteeing a certain number of Americans on the field at all times, I recall personally being very strongly in favor of that. As I said, it's one of the reasons I signed Beckenbauer, so that he would be on the field controlling, I hoped, a bunch of American kids. But Phil was, and names of players on the back of the shirt and that kind of stuff. That was all, I think, all Phil's ideas.
You think, though, the rules, though, that was helpful, though. I look at the point system, and you'd think maybe today that some of the games in some of the international leagues could benefit from 35-yard line. Probably a bit more controversial, right? You can make the argument there, but the point system where you're rewarding some attacking soccer play, it seems like that was a good thing that helped make the sport a little bit more, shall we say, dynamic, perhaps for the unwashed American audiences.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it didn't hurt at all.
All right. I guess sort of the last real, big question would be, let's call it sort of the legacy, right? So, there are a lot of people look back at the NASL and say, it certainly was sort of that sort of once in a lifetime kind of thing. It's never going to be replicated. MLS's more sane approach to life. But frankly, I think there's a lot more people who would sort of say, without the NASL, there wouldn't be whatever there is today, Major League Soccer, a potentially competitive U.S. national team. The World Cup, we didn't even talk about that. Maybe we could just start there and then go to your sort of your legacy sort of answer.
Without the NASL, yep. One thing that wouldn't be taking place for sure is this conversation. And another thing that wouldn't be taking place is your conversation with anybody else about the game of soccer. The NASL did it, and I don't mean to say I did it, or Phil Woosnam did it. The NASL, with its collective work, some of it good, some of it brilliant, some of it not so good, some of it terrible, changed the entire picture. From literally when we started, people would say, "Oh, soccer, what's soccer? Oh, what's that, like kickball, is it? You play? No, I didn't know that. And what's the World Cup? And what's a national team? And, why are you doing this? Do they play this anywhere else?" I mean, we were communist midgets, according to a newspaper I think it was in San Francisco, intruding into the American game. In Baltimore, I remember being asked by, I forget his name now, with one of the big Baltimore newspapers, when we reached the championship game in '67, playing Oakland in the final. He said, "So if you beat Oakland, you'll be world champions, right?" So I said, "Well, no, because there are so many other countries where soccer is played, and we would only be champions of this league. Not like a team in the NFL is world champion, or Major League Baseball is world champion, or the NBA is world champion, because nobody else plays those bloody games. But everyone plays our game, and so we won't be world champions." I mean, that was the kind of mentality that existed. So it was from almost zero. I said the only place the game existed then was in little narrow ethnic groups in various cities. It existed in St. Louis. It existed in Annapolis. The Naval Academy in Annapolis had a soccer team, and Glenn Warner, their coach, was known because he was the only soccer coach in Maryland. I mean, it was nothing around. So if it hadn't been for the NASL, there'd still be nothing around.
Well, now, that's certainly an interesting set of chatter and conversation, don't you think? Not one to mince words, and certainly a legendary career in the building and the shaping of the professional soccer game in this country with Clive Toye, who we thank tremendously for being a guest. And of course, if you want to go deeper into some of the things that we proverbially just scratched the surface on, the book you need to get is called A Kick in the Grass, The Slow Rise and Quick Demise of the NASL. Came out in 2006. It's published by our friends at St. Johann Press. And believe me when I say in this 170, almost 180 pages or so, it's chock full of stuff. It's chock full of great stories, anecdotes, some eyebrow-raising tales, a number of very interesting and hard to find, if not impossible to find, photography and knickknacks and things from the career of Clive Toye during the North American Soccer League, and I highly recommend it. You should also check out Clive's other books, Anywhere in the World, which came out in 2015, also in St. Johann Press, which is a look into the international lens, if you will, of the game and where it is today and kind of how it got there. And for you kids out there, Toby and the Greatest Game, which is published by iUniverse, is also out there. We're going to have links to all of those books on our website, which I highly encourage you to check out, of course, at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our interview with Clive Toye, and you will see links to all those books, as well as some other cool stuff, a little bit of description of the show, and some links to some cool stuff related to what Clive and I just got finished talking about. We also want to remind you that we are active, and then some, on social media. Feel free to follow us there, too, will you? On Twitter, you'll find us at GoodSeatsStill. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You can like us on Facebook. And if you want to send us some email, by all means do that. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And again, if you go to the website, you'll also be able to sign up for our weekly newsletter and find out all kinds of other good stuff, see our old episodes, etc. So by all means do that. And once again, we, of course, we could not do this without the good work and the kind graces of our friend Jerry Payne and his friends at Podfly Productions. That's podfly.net. get your podcasting needs served there, will you? And we thank them and him, as always, for the great production work that he and they do. All right, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate your listening, and hopefully we'll hear you or see you or talk to you again in the very near future. Take care, everybody.